So we're here to talk about the Soul of Civility, the book Lexi wrote. It was out this February, correct? Is that when it was?
No, it came out in October. Actually, it came out 3 days after Hamas invaded Israel. So happy to talk about the ramifications of that. Does that launch date make it less important or more important? Let's discuss.
Yeah, and that's an amazing point. And I clearly was off by about 5 months on the launch date. Have February in my notes from somewhere. No taken. So I think for me, one, the topic itself is deeply important. As a military vet and a special needs father, the idea of kind of putting personal dignity at the center of your value system, I thought was great. And in reading through it, one, I loved the kind of deep academic and historical treatment of the topic, which kind of and philosophy and deep philosophical background and context too was great. But I thought just the idea of kind of changing the dialogue from politeness to civility was really, really deeply important. And kind of the mandate that comes along with that is not silence or what we would generally think of civility as just going along to go along, but kind of a harsher call to action. And I think you highlight that a lot in the book. And really, really important message now, like especially as the presidential election progresses and your political background and how it applies to current events is super, super interesting, important. I think what's also interesting is there's a fantastic book, and Anna, I know this is a book that I recommended to you, in American Nations, is a book about the 11 different regions of North America.
Yeah, Colin Woodard, he's a friend.
Yeah,
And I'll Be Unseed, which he drew from. That was really influential to him. I don't know if you know I'll Be Unseed, the book that was kind of informative.
Yeah. What I thought was interesting there is how regularly he draws this distinction between honor code and personal dignity as the drivers behind the different behaviors. And I'm a Midlander by birth. I'm a South Jersey, raised by a single mother school teacher. And so she was a Midlander down to her bones. And she believed deeply in personal dignity and manners, by the way. She was a fantastic stickler for manners, which is interesting, your background too. But just that idea that as a first principle, treating people with personal dignity kind of is wired through my belief system, my faith. And I really thought that was if we started there as in the discussion and then took it from there, how it would go.
I'd love to start there because I've written this book 1,000 times. Like, I kid you not, I've been working on this book for 10 years, but also my whole life to some extent. And I really started thinking about it deeply, and I like writing drafts when I was in a very kind of toxic and unhappy job in federal government, like living in the belly of the beast, immersed in the division, the dehumanization that I write about. It was like my personal proximity to this problem and being this environment of anti-human flourishing, disrespect for human dignity on like the day-to-day basis, that I kind of, we things are illuminated when we encounter their opposites, right? And so that really galvanized me. But I remember early drafts and iterations of this project. Oh my gosh, they were beautiful, but so boring. They were just like all about Immanuel Kant, about, what is dignity and what does it mean to be human, and what is man? And I brought in Blaise Pascal, who's still, throughout my book, he's a huge intellectual force and mentor and formative influence for me. And just different iterations of it. Where is the dignity of man located? Is it our rationality? Is it our free will? Is it our speech? And it was just like very academic and dry. What is it? And I talked about the Judeo-Christian tradition. That Man's dignity comes from the divine imprint, the notion that of the imago Dei, that God was created in God's image. This is Genesis 1:27 in the Hebrew Bible, that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, both male and female, that humankind is created in the image of the divine. And that means that every single one of us has value, innate, irreducible, moral worth that can never be taken away, never be diminished. And that means that we have certain moral obligations to others, all others. Not unlimited obligations, but some, even those that we hate, even those that we deeply disagree with and might even despise. And so that it's fun to think back about those sample chapters. I remember like it's kind of I ended up like, eliminating Kant entirely from my book. I don't think, maybe I quote him in like one little sidebar quote, but I instead like made my argument about human dignity and imago Dei and personhood, and in many cases, the foundational argument I make about civility through Dr. King, who makes the same point just as well, if not better, and is a much more kind of amenable messenger to draw from in this time. Although I will tell you a story. One time I was on a C-SPAN segment a few months ago, and it was an hour-long segment. It was very, very long, and a good portion of that was users or viewers calling into the show. And I got this one call. Someone said, I'm an African American man, and I just find it deeply offensive that you as a white woman are quoting Dr. King and that you're even reading him. Like, I just need you to stop quoting him, stop it. And I was like, like there's some thinkers that belong to everyone. They're just so vibrant and so enmeshed in the human intellectual tradition and the great conversation, this formative, iterative dialogue across time and place about the foundational questions we're talking about tonight. What does it mean to be human? What is the good life? What is the best way to live? And Dr. King both drew from that, and he comprises it himself. And that belongs to absolutely everyone. And that's very much kind of the intellectual tradition that I draw from throughout the book.
I think, and we included this in the recommended reading, but the letters from a Birmingham jail are you should, my perspective, they're foundational documents for us now.
Yes.
We have founding documents, and we shouldn't be satisfied with having them end from the very, very beginning. We have things like the Gettysburg Address. We have things like letters from a Birmingham jail that are the progression of who we are, and just that's a foundational document of justice that is relevant to that specific struggle, but it travels.
Yeah.
The idea that justice too long delayed is justice denied. The idea of just and unjust laws are like goes all the way back. What was so poignant about that, the original writing of it, but then back to where he talked about it, is it goes right down into the dignity, and that the strongest messages of progress are for people who want to be part of that general whole.
Yeah.
Taking away from a fixed pie.
Yeah.
It's a really amazing document, and I love that I went back and had to read it again because it'd been a minute, and you should go.
Right. And this is the thing about a great book, a great work of art. Like, you can revisit it time and time again, and it teaches you anew every time. And I will just shamelessly say to everyone, if you haven't already got a copy of my book, the good people over at Amazon.com have discounted it $2.99 for the ebook. So go get your copy. Hot. It's not hot off the presses anymore, but the sale is still hot, still valid through the end of July, I think. So buy it, gift it. And I should have told you guys that before our conversation tonight. But yeah, it is there.
And the audiobook is you reading it. So
It is yours truly. And that was a lot of fun. Exhausting, but a lot of fun. So, Amazon also bought my audiobook. And when they could just kind of sat on it for months. So they bought it like, almost a year before my book came out. And finally, we're like a month or two out from publication date. And they're like, oh, can you record your audiobook like how about publication week? And I'm like, no, I'm going to be terribly busy because my book's going to be a smashing success and it's going to be a runaway bestseller. Like, no, I cannot. But it was the only time we would do it. Otherwise, like I was booked. I was like literally traveling. I've been in 45 cities and 5 countries on book tour the last 7, 8 months. So anyway, I agreed to Amazon that I would record publication week. I was set to be in New York for my book launch anyway, so we booked a studio in New York. But I said to Amazon, I was like, you can't be angry with me if I have to run out to interviews and television. Like, you have to understand this is publication week, And as I mentioned at the beginning of this call, the Hamas invaded Israel 3 days before my book came out. And nobody wanted to talk about civility on October 10th of 2024. No, 2023. What year are we in? Yeah, 2023. And I was terribly available. I got my audiobook done in record time. It was still exhausted. It was still several days there. I had a few podcasts that came to me and a few radio things, but it was like a very quiet publication week. Like, we plan, God laughs. Like, I had put my life's work into this book, and this is like my gift to the world, and just you can't control what happens in the world. And it was a very sad time in the world. People were rightly focused on kids were being slaughtered. It was just a terrible time. But I kind of doubled down kind of psychologically and realized that my book is about human dignity. It's about personhood. It's about what we owe the other when stakes are high, when we don't want to recognize the personhood and dignity of those we don't like in time. And we need that especially in times of war, especially in high stakes elections like we're in the thick of right now here in America, and actually around the world. Around the world, it's been fun to travel the world and speak to places like French Parliament, like the English House of Lords, like Canadian Parliament. Like, we are, on one hand, this year marks a high watermark for democracy, for our democratic institutions. Half the globe is going to the polls this year. On the other hand, the threats to democracy seem like they're higher than they ever have been before. We have growing hyperpartisanship and extremism and political violence directed towards people we disagree with. And that's happening not just in America, it's happening everywhere. It's happening in Europe, it's happening around the world. And I realize that and many other reasons are what make my book relevant. A relevant conversation doesn't offer all the answers, but it clarifies the questions and it offers some fodder for productive dialogue.
I think bringing up the timing of it brings me back to kind of a memory I had from my very first deployment as a young naval officer. We were due to leave and come back home when 9/11 happened. And at the time, there was so much anger, similar to how there was this last October, about the nature of the attacks and being on civilians. And there was a lot of ends justify the means.
Right, that apocalyptic, it's so seductive, it's so tempting.
And I think what I thought would be interesting to get your thoughts on, just kind of the antidote to that, is that commitment to, again, I keep bringing up personal dignity, but it's not unimportant to the extent that it's what actually keeps us from responding in kind to horrific acts. And in a lot of ways, we failed those tests as people. And I was in and around and a part of that. And my always with me through Iraq or Horn of Africa, wherever I was, usually as a small unit commander, was that thought that we're alone and accountable for the actions. Is the idea, if you lead with the personal dignity of everybody you encounter,
yeah,
you're going to safeguard yourself from that. The ends justifies the means, which is for me, that's some of the worst of what we are. It'd be interesting to get your perspective on.
Well, it's interesting you talk about your experience in war, because I was thinking about war, not as much as I wrote this book, but while my book was being birthed into the world for obvious reasons, because of I was in the wake of October 7th. And I do have this exploration of a concept in my book that is relevant to war. It's in my chapter on civility and freedom. And it's why civility and self-governance is kind of the social contract that supports the social contract, like our voluntary decisions to comply with social norms and rituals, and just to consider the needs of others alongside of ourselves. That is what supports a free and flourishing society. And I talk about this speech that Lord Moulton gave to the House of Commons in the wake of World War I. He had been war minister during World War I. So he's someone who had seen and thought a lot about war. And in this speech to the House of Commons, he says, there are three spheres of human life. There is a sphere of positive law, where government directs what we do and don't do. There's a sphere of pure agency, on the other hand, where we have total control over what we do. And within these two spheres, positive law and pure agency, there is a sphere that he called obedience to the unenforceable. And that is the sphere where we have the ability to choose to act well when we otherwise might have the chance to not act well. It's how we act when there are no consequences to acting poorly towards others, when no one's looking. And this concept of obedience to the unenforceable, you know, compliance with a moral code, justice, even when we don't have to, that applies at the macro level and the micro level. It applies at the macro level. There's this body of law, like international law, like the international war law, you know, but it's actually, they're more like international war norms. Like my husband's an attorney, and any attorney who will tell you, like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, they have no teeth. It doesn't really exist. It's like not a thing, you know, like war crimes they're like really violation of war norms, you know, and because there is no uber state, this like sovereign cosmic body that has control over every national, like sovereign national entity in the world. Like really in times of war, we're hoping and we're expecting leaders to act well when they have the chance not to act well in times of war, choosing not to use chemical weapons on enemies or their own citizens, choosing not to target and intentionally hurt women, children, hospitals, and vulnerable populations. These are all parts of like international law, but they're really, again, they're international norms, right? There are no real teeth. No, of course, sanctions exist, but we're not going to invade someone for doing that, you know, like that, you know, that for better or for worse. But so that exists, that compliance with a kind of objective moral code that exists at the macro level, it also exists at the micro level in our everyday. How do we treat our Uber driver and our grocery store clerk who's checking us out at CVS or at Kroger or at Whole Foods? You know, that how do we treat people who can never do anything for us, who won't be able to return a favor, or we don't need anything from, or that we'll never see again? And in this anonymous, commercialized world that we live in, we have those transactions every day. Like people will never see again, people we don't need things from. It's just that we're there for a transaction. We want to move on. And yet those things matter. The stakes matter. How we choose to show up in those situations have enormous consequences for whether our society is truly civilized, whether democracy survives, and whether we'll truly flourish. So it's interesting that you were thinking about these kind of things as well while you were serving. Thank you for your service, by the way.
It was my pleasure, mostly. Carol, you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I haven't read the book. I did hear you on a podcast, but so I don't know your argument. So I'm just curious, you must have a take on where these norms come from. Is it culture? Is it some sort of innate, you know, rational morality that we can find through reason? Is it God really exists and we all truly have this soul and we just need to recognize that? So it's a spiritual question. Like, what's your underlying argument regarding what is the source of these norms, and therefore what makes them more or less prevalent at any given time in society?
It's a great question. So I'm a Christian, I'm a theist, and I'm open about that at the introduction of my book. Like I think it's only intellectually honest to let people know where you're coming from. I'm also kind of a classical liberal, like old school classical liberal, like libertarian. And that's just I call that owning my priors. Like I want people to know where I'm coming from philosophically. However, my second chapter in my book, I do show that there is a remarkable continuity. There's kind of this core of human wisdom about the good life that people have come to independently across time and place. For example, the oldest book in the world is called The Teachings of Ptahhotep, given to us 2350 BC, so almost 4,000 years old. And in this book, it could be it's all this like very conventional wisdom that our mother, grandmother, or we might read about, it might have taught us, and that we might read about in like a conventional, advice column in Miss Manners in the Washington Post, for example. It's things like don't slander, don't malign someone, their reputation behind their back when they can't defend themselves. Don't abuse a power differential. Be good and gracious to those whom you have power over. Don't be utilitarian. Don't be good to your friends and neighbors just when you need something. Be good to them all the time, just because they're human beings just like you. And so ancient Egypt, that's like a very different time, a very different place from our own. And yet these principles have really stood the test of time. They just kind of work. And I resurface thinkers and writers and texts from across history, from across culture, from ancient Sanskrit and Indian culture to, North African culture to the Middle Ages to the Renaissance to ancient Greece to our own American context. In fact, I'm writing a piece for Time magazine right now about the Emily Post of the medieval era that probably no one's ever heard of. His name was Daniel of Beccles, he wrote this like epic work like with manners and etiquette about every area of life that are remarkably relevant to to our own moment today. And this is fascinating to me because that people can independently observe the human condition and human nature and just say what works, observe what doesn't, and they can they've just deduced that just by pure. Sometimes there is this kind of like there are custodians of wisdom. They look to those who have come before them and revive wisdom of the past. And sometimes people just independently say what works and what doesn't. Let's do more of what works and less than of what doesn't. And I think it's because human nature doesn't change. We're the same today as we were the dawn of our species, including when the first book was written almost 4,000 years ago. And that's a core argument of my book, that this is a timeless question, a timeless problem that gets to the core of who we are, that it's not a modern Western American democratic problem. This has been around as long as we've been around. And yet the solution is also timeless. And the solution is civility. It's basic respect for the dignity and personhood of the other, even though those that we disagree. It's the art of human flourishing. And as Sean alluded to when he gave a little overview of the book, it's more than mere politeness. It's more than just etiquette, the technique of going through the motions and doing and saying the nice thing. So I love to hear any response you have.
Well, I like the idea. I'm not sure I believe it. I'm thinking, it's interesting that you say you're a Christian. I'm thinking of the book Dominion. Are you familiar with that?
I am. Tom Holland.
Yeah.
He's not
So I haven't read the whole thing, but I read some of it. And it seems to me, and you may know better than me, but that he's making sort of the opposite argument to you, that he's saying that if you look at the norms of the ancient world before Christianity developed, that there's just a level of taken for granted brutality and acceptance that the strong rule and that's right and the way it should be and so on, and that Christianity was really this culturally revolutionary force, and that the norms that you're describing that we take for granted sort of and become highly secularized in Western society about the innate dignity and so on, that's really like the process of a long-standing historical development, and the fact that this particular way of looking at humanity evolved over time, and this religion happened to come into power and so on. I'm not sure he's saying that it wouldn't exist elsewhere, that, you know, there's not other traditions that do the same thing, but I think he makes a really strong case that, say, the Greco-Roman world prior to Christianity was radically different in its understanding of humanity, and, you know, whether or not every person has innate dignity and so on, than the culture that developed afterwards. So I was just wondering, yeah, so you just think he's wrong, or am I characterizing the argument wrong?
No, I think he's correct, but I think that people have still independently found a grain of human wisdom. So like, Tom Holland's argument, for example, is that the Roman world had no concept of universal human dignity. They had no concept of caritas, of Christian charity, like that these ideas have implications today that we take for granted, such as universal human rights and universal human dignity. And we care deeply for the oppressed, for minorities, for example. We care about people with disabilities, people who for most of human history have been marginalized. Most cultures in the world have said, you are not my tribe, therefore you don't matter. I take your life in battle, I take your life for any reason. Doesn't matter, like that. But at the same time that that's been the case, I do, in my chapter on hospitality, also show that there is this through line, that there is this sort of milk of human goodness, that tradition, that I think could arguably stem from the benefits of reciprocity. So, for example, I talk about in my chapter on hospitality how at the same time that there was sort of this contingent logic, like you're not my tribe, therefore you're not as valuable, your life doesn't matter as much. At the same time, cultures, pagan cultures and Christian cultures alike, hospitality is very central to the Christian faith, like such as, Christ's parable of the Good Samaritan, showing above and beyond super erogatory graciousness and kindness and generosity to someone who is not of your tribe. Like that's radical. But there is this tradition, for example, I talk about, there's a tradition across culture. For example, I ground the story, that chapter in hospitality, in a really timeless story in history. There is a man named Eumaeus, and Eumaeus, he has not much in the way of personal belongings or personal possessions. He's really underprivileged. And yet one day he encounters someone who appears to have even less than he does. And he welcomes this poor stranger, this disadvantaged stranger, into his home. He gives him a bath. He says, can I feed you? He gives him clothes to wear. He says, rest for a while, stay. And only after he's met his immediate physical needs, then he asks, tell me your story. Who are you? And it turns out that this is Eumaeus's long lost and beloved master, Odysseus, who's been lost at sea for a decade after fleeing the Trojan War. And this is one of my favorite stories in Homer's Odyssey. And this concept of xenia, of hospitality, was so central to ancient Greek culture, but also it's the central theme in the Odyssey. And Homer, in every single vignette, it's all about Odysseus meeting good hosts and bad hosts. It's about the guest-host relationship and the laws and norms that govern that. So, for example, when Odysseus and his men launch on the island of the Cyclops, they meet Polymephus. And Polymephus is not a very good host. Odysseus arrives and he obliges the duties of a good guest. For example, his men are starving. They want to go into Polymephus's cave and eat all of his food. And Odysseus says, no, we're not going to someone's home and eating their food without asking. Are you insane? Like, no. We arrive, we present ourselves, we wait until we're invited, and then we partake, we feast together, we break bread together. So he follows, he's very, meticulous, following these rules of propriety of the guest host relationship. And then what does Polymephus do when they arrive? He eats his men. So here's a host, abusing and taking advantage of the vulnerability of a guest, they're strangers in a strange land. And that's a really vulnerable position. He exploits that. He picks up one of Odysseus' soldiers and mouths down on him for dinner. And so that is, Polymephus is a villain in the Odyssey for that reason. Like he's violating these sacred bounds of the guest host relationship. And there's so many other examples of that, when Odysseus is kept by Calypso, the goddess, against his will on the island. Like, don't keep a guest against his will. If the guest wants to leave, let him go. The whole of the Odyssey is exploring these timeless principles, truly, that of ideals that govern the guest host relationship that are still prevalent today, and it's really valorized in ancient Greece to show kindness to the stranger, just as Eumaeus did to Odysseus. He didn't know it was his master, and we see that throughout other religious and other religious traditions, and also like other linguistic literary traditions as well. Like, the stranger is gods in disguise. You never know who you might be showing hospitality to. And, we see this in the Old Testament, for example, Abraham showing, welcoming the strangers, who end up being 3 angels, but that's in many other traditions as well. And so there's just this ethical through line that says, err on the side of caution. You never know when you might be showing kindness or not kindness to a god in disguise. And you never know when you or someone you love might be in need of that hospitality too.
So I love that. The other thing I think about a ton anytime we talk about Rome or Tom Holland, and I've written a couple of reviews on Tom Holland books, and is also something I studied as an undergrad. But the amazing thing about Roman history for me is how much of the 4 million or so ancients that were part of the Roman Empire are completely silent in Roman history. And so what you see is a very large history and very detailed accounts of the politics and the elite of Rome, but very, very little about the kind of the nuts and bolts and the flesh and blood of what it was to be a day-to-day human being. And I think if you zoom out into the political and into the economic, or even the kind of the power structures, you start to lose your way in the civility space in a way that we still struggle with today. You can get the politics of dignity quite wrong. And some part of Holland's thesis as you go through from Republic to Empire is that you wander further and further away from the dignity, and you get a very kind of a version of liberty that's about strength, a version of politics that's about might makes right. Mm-hmm. But it's disconnected from the majority of the people who suffer quite unjust outcomes through it. And I think if I tie that back to I think I'm looking at one of the things I wrote right now is like, it's the politicians right now sound way more similar to the Roman Republic politicians than like many of us should be comfortable. And that so many of the rules of politics and even of government, especially at the executive level, are norms based. And if you drop the norms, you end up getting down into the power dynamics of things, and you lose the signal.
Right.
And I think it's just an interesting push. I think, Carol, that it's a great point. I think like the layers are material in that, like what politics are.
I think it's a great point. Like, how do you square these two things? On one hand, there was there was this sort of might makes right logic that defined, especially the classical world, and on the other hand, there was this there were certain obligations that you had to the stranger, and so I think how to square these two things is that even the logic of hospitality to the extent that it exists in the Odyssey, it's contingent and it has limits, right? Like Polymephus, the moment he eats one of Odysseus's men, all bets are off, right? And this is war. And what does Odysseus do? He's wily, he's crafty, he blinds the Cyclops and escapes. Like you're in it for your life, and anything is justified at that point. Once someone breaks the rules, you're justified to go balls to the wall, like scorched earth, like all bets are off. You do whatever is necessary to win. And
But are all strangers accorded hospitality? I mean, I don't know, but in that context, I would assume that, certain strangers would merit hospitality because they are somehow of equal rank, even if perhaps they're of enemy. But would women,
Yeah.
would slaves, would, I mean, it just seems like my understanding of the ancient world is not great, but as Sean was saying, like, I think the concept of democracy was explicitly located in a very select group of people,
Yeah.
and that was not just kind of, oh, we want to include everybody, but we can't yet. It was, unapologetic. And so I would just assume that this concept of hospitality is not would not only be contingent on how people respond, but actually who that person is and whether or not they're within a class of person that deserves that treatment. It would seem very strange if that were not the case.
Right. And so I think like the Greek word for norm is related to the concept of like a sundial. It's like a compass. It's like a normative, it's a normative ideal that people strive for. And you can assess the strength of a norm by how vociferously and fiercely people react when a norm is broken. And so like just going back to Odysseus for a moment, when he's astounded, he's scandalized when Polymephus eats his men. Like he's obeyed the rules and he's assumed the best about his host, and his host violates the rules. And so he's really scandalized, by that. And what I was about to say, but that proves the rule. It proves that, the rule is that you give people the benefit of the doubt, and you obey the rules of being a good guest, and you obey the rules of being a good host until given a reason to do otherwise. And what's interesting about, putting that story in dialogue with the story of the Good Samaritan, for example, like, when, remind me, is it a Jewish person is this a Samaritan who helps sorry, this is horrible, but is a Samaritan who helps, who's beaten? Is it a Jewish person or who is it? Just a person? I forget the other tribe.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Anyway, it's like, and it's like maybe it is a Jewish person. Let's assume that it is, because Christ is talking to a Jewish context. I think that's the case, but I'm open to being corrected on that. So, because I think he's trying to make the point that he's like celebrating a Jewish enemy in his story, that the Samaritan is the one that did the right thing when the rabbis and other people passed by the person in need. So anyway, the point is that the Samaritan had every reason to be skeptical of, let's just say, the Jewish person, the person who is part of a people group that the Samaritan had cause to be skeptical of, right? And he ignores that and is incredibly benevolent and gracious anyways, like picks up the person and takes him to the inn and says, please care for this person, and whatever his needs are, and even potential future needs, like I'll take care of it, I'll cover it. This super erogatory act of grace and kindness and charity, like that's pretty unheard of. Like if you have reason to suspect that someone is not trustworthy, like they're a part of an enemy tribe, then that logic of grace doesn't apply. Like don't risk it. Like this is as Sean was saying, this is a dog eat dog world where might makes right. And this is exactly the logic that Christ is speaking to a Jewish audience enmeshed in Roman culture that is very familiar with this context.
Yeah, I think
so that would suggest that there is something revolutionary about the kind of the universalizing message of Christianity.
And I agree that there is. I totally agree that there is. I totally agree I'm
So-
a Christian. I love that Tom Holland is a secular, classicist, is like singing the virtues of the Christian faith, to a world that's really hostile to Christianity. I love that. But I also think that it's, you don't have, it doesn't have to be either or. You can still acknowledge beautiful elements in the classical world and noble, virtuous elements in the classical world without saying, without crediting Christianity for that, because these things existed before Christianity. So to my mind, they're not totally mutually exclusive.
I think it's interesting too to realize, and we tend not to think of this as a one and then the other thing. These are actually happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And so as a Christian, as much as I'd like to believe the lightning bolt strikes and the universe changes, there was some building on contemporary norms. But I also think it's I get really focused on the politics side of the Roman Empire, because that's all there is. It's not all there is, but it is the dominant theme that we follow. It's hard to understate how much detail we have of that based on the timeline that they have. It's incredible, just how much is documented throughout time and space,
Right.
and how much of it actually remains consistent. It's really hard to imagine that some of the foundational interpersonal stuff, for me, this is my perspective, I wasn't there, is massively different. I did have another
tiny footnote, like in my mind, finding beautiful things in other cultures that are not my own culture, like that's additive to my philosophy of life, to my philosophy of flourishing, to my philosophy of my book. Like to find something, beautiful and virtuous and good and noble and warm and hospitable and, ancient Greek culture, Sanskrit culture, like that affirms to me, that aligns with my worldview, like that to me doesn't diminish my faith or first, preconceived notions. Like it's not as if everything good has to originate from, Christianity for me to be happy with it or to accept it. That's not at all the case. And that's very much a spirit in my book as well, that I hope you'll appreciate.
Oh, for sure. It's just more a question of, are human cultures truly fundamentally different on some of these normative questions, or are they all essentially the same? And
well, you're getting
that
at
does strike me as
exactly.
a kind of critical question, because if you think that we always have the same norms and it doesn't really kind of matter what religion is dominant, or, then then I guess the question would be, how do those norms sort of, float to the top more in different times than others, because they're always innate. But if if it's more of a cultural thing and historical thing, then that would give more credence, like, to the view that a lot of conservatives have today. It's like, well, our culture is really messed up because of the waning of a Judeo-Christian culture. Once that foundation is gone, we don't have the same sort of norms governing it. But that wouldn't really matter if everybody innately always has the same norms. We could have a wholly secular culture. It just doesn't matter, So I do kind of feel like it's an important distinction to make, just philosophically, of how truly different cultures are in terms of foundational norms.
Well, what you're getting at, Carol, is exactly the foundational question of philosophy, which is one and the many, like what is true in all times and places, and what is a universal truth, and what is a particular truth, what is culturally contingent. This is the exact question of civility. Like what are the principles, the timeless principles of human flourishing that, and in fact, have stood the test of time. To your to borrow your analogy, like that have that float above the fray, that have just worked for people across history. They've been passed down or independently discovered and can be observed across independently. And what is culturally contingent? Because you're absolutely right that, there are many variations in social norms and many different questions, cultural contingencies. But those contingencies exist within the context of like our universal human nature. Like human nature doesn't change fundamentally. That's a core argument, throughout the book. So it's an excellent question, and like the core question of the book that I explore as well.
I have a bit of a change of pace question in the, we're coming up on time. We get seven minutes. I deeply appreciate your referencing your mother's impact on kind of your perspectives, and that she was a part of this book. My mom was she grew up in a fairly well-off suburb of Manhattan, and then married into south side of Atlantic City. Not really her family wasn't very happy about that. Marriage ended up disintegrating, and being the person that she was, she wasn't going to admit and go back home to where she came from. We stayed, and we're south side of Atlantic City folks, but she always carried with her like this very, very firm belief in manners and etiquette. And
Yeah, I'm on the phone right now though, so and then I have to go walk Lucy. So could maybe come over a little later or tomorrow morning? Would that work?
we got and so like as you reference her input into it, it was a little heartwarming for me, because he's reminding me of my mom, and she's been gone for a while.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and I think about it too, because it, like, no matter where I was, and I went off when I went off to the Annapolis, etiquette and manners were like a very big part of our early schooling, and it was like the one thing I could do well. I already knew how to do it.
Yeah.
So it'd be great to hear your perspective on her impact to you.
Oh my gosh, my mother is, my best friend and my biggest champion, and she drives me crazy. And I also couldn't have written this book or done the book tour without her. She was on book tour with me with my two kids for much of where I've been the last 8 months. It's been a great adventure. And, she kind of feels torn between being my paparazzi and my greatest supporter, but also being on the trip for the purpose I invited her, which is really to help me with the kids. Like I couldn't just be away from my kids for 8 months. And so I remember one time early on in a book tour, it was one of my first, it was even before the book came out. I was giving a talk at Indiana University, and before several colleagues, people I know and respect, and my mom's supposed to be watching my kids, but I invited her because I wanted her to feel, and I want my kids to see what I do. So I invited her to come, and she leaves the kids at the back of the room, and she sneaks to the front and like is videoing me. This is like her first time seeing me give a speech on book tour. And over the course of the next several minutes, like my 20-minute talk, both my kids, one by one, come on stage with me. And by the end, I'm like holding two kids in my arms, and my mom, bless her, is still videoing me. Like she can't bring herself to stop. And she doesn't see me like, glaring daggers at her while I'm on stage trying to like deliver this talk. But part of me was like, if I can deliver this speech, give a book talk through this, I can do it through anything. And finally, she had the wherewithal to like, this is what she does. She gives her phone to sit the person next to her, and then like ushers the kid, coaxes them off stage. So I have like, my final 2 minutes to deliver without kids in my arms. But I mean, she's just the most joy-filled and wonderful human being that I know, and just so giving and gracious and kind, even in the face. And she's like the embodiment of true civility, where she just loves and gives, even when it's not deserved and even when it's not reciprocated. And she is someone who, I have this concept in my book called the mellifluous echo of the magnanimous soul. And it's really a concept that tries to quantify the unquantifiable. How one person's life, the ripple effect of their life and cumulative effect of their decisions that they've made to reach out to others, to invite people into their home and their life, to reach across the divide, that we will never see this side of eternity, the good that people who live according to that logic do. And that was my grandmother. That's who I unpack this concept in the context of my grandmother's life and legacy. But, my mom's the same way. She's just someone who, she's never met a stranger. She'll have a 20-minute flight with someone and leave with a new best friend. And I personally, like, it just exhausts me to think about all the relationships she like upkeeps, all the outreach she does every day. Like, it's incredible. And there's no question that and there are people like her, not exactly like her, but there are people who can, in that vein, that make the world a warmer place, a more connected place. And like in our crisis of division, the opioid epidemic, our loneliness crisis, there is no question that they are part of the solution, and our voluntary acts of charity, grace, reaching across the divide, making bids for friendship, not worrying about whether they're rejected, but continuing to make them anyways, that is a part of the solution to our deeply divided and lonely and alienated world.
I love that. We are just about at time. We can end on the magnanimous soul, which is a great, I love that story, and I love the towering grace that the people in our lives that are like that leave with us and leave us to carry with us too. Amazing story. Anybody else? Any input? Carol, you had a great question. Faye or Lexi, we can end it there.
Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate you having me.
Thanks for doing
you. Congrats.
Thanks, everyone.